Okay, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to the first episode, the pilot episode of the Supply Unchained podcast. Today, we are honored to have Anzar Kamdar, Chief Decision Scientist of Throughput, currently to be our first guest today as we launch off and kick off this podcast. So, Anzar, welcome to the studio. Good to see you. How are things going on your side?
Thank you, Ollie. Things are going quite well. I'm just starting the new year. Uh, Everything's going well. Really honored to be here.
Excellent. So, a lot of people have asked us to join their podcast, do their podcast, start a podcast. So, I thought maybe just to start out with the audience and get them familiarized with the concept of Supply Unchained podcast. Why don't we start out about maybe just talking about why we're starting this and why we saw a void that still needs to be filled. So maybe over to you, like maybe your thoughts on like what is going on in the supply chain space and where we could add value through allowing voices that are typically not accessible to be heard and share their viewpoints.
Yeah, so as far as the gap that exists currently, most, let's say, marketing and webinars and supply chain podcasts, conferences, they're essentially filled with very narrow perspectives and they're typically selling something. Uh, and as a result, some of the high quality, practitioners and high quality practitioners and information is getting lost. So we are trying to address that gap by bringing to the fore some of these experts that have helped us as we got started in the space, have helped me personally. And yeah, we're just looking forward to sharing some of this, knowledge and information with the larger audience out there.
Yeah, similar story with you, and we've been on this journey almost a decade now. So the void that you see often is that hey, like there is this form of knowledge bottleneck that needs to be addressed, preserved. That I feel if more people had access to, they could not only improve their operations but round out the supply chain knowledge that we've acquired, at least in the last 8 to 10 years, which we would not have otherwise been able to do so. And so there's a lot of voids, right? So let's speak to some of the first voids that we want to speak about, which is hey, like preserving knowledge. Where are we in terms of preserving knowledge in this space, and why do you think that's important?
So it's extremely important, especially now with this push around data, AI, and newer technologies coming out. They're coming with newer paradigms to solve problems that have typically been solved previously. There is essentially a loss of capabilities in a lot of organizations. When we say supply chain, it is as part of a larger function to the organization. Even that is getting lost. So again, as you mentioned, for me personally, when I started a decade ago in the space, I've gone through the whole academic circuit, with MIT with supply chain management. I've gone through DHL, which could be considered a second university in supply chain. Yet at the same time, it wasn't until we actually, had access to some of these experts that we actually understood the problem and some of the problems that have always faced supply chains, material flow operations, and industrial organizations. And it's important to bring that to the fore. I'm not saying that those organizations and those centers of learnings were not useful. It's just the reality of organizations right now. Um, it seems like some of these capabilities are being lost, and there's a lot of solutions out there and a lot of people pitching solutions that are essentially trying to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I feel the same way, right? So, educating operational people on how supply chains really work, right? This is something coming from my background in pharma, oil field, academia. I sort of saw the same gap, which is why do we use like words that are basically mean the same things,
Yep.
more or less the same, right? But they just create these communication and knowledge silos that, if integrated together, might be more useful. So, from say you come from operations and supply chain, right? What can the average audience user or someone tuning in expect from this? Like, what did they get out of something like this that they wouldn't sitting at a academia course somewhere in say Berlin, for example?
So maybe I can just give you an example from my background, right? So I also come from originally an engineering background. I'm perhaps the only person in my family to go towards science and engineering. I come from a big line of business professionals that have, run factories, run warehouses, done construction operations. And a lot of the knowledge in actually running those businesses, you do hear about in these academic courses, right? So let me give you an example for construction. Uh, for our company, we had 2,000 employees. We manage some of these trade-offs very intuitively. When we're talking about having optionality with multiple suppliers for cement, having a supplier that can deliver quicker as far as the lead time, but cost more, as long as it doesn't actually hold up your construction site.
Yeah.
So these sort of ideas have been around for a while, and that's what they actually teach you in some of these academic environments. However, there is a large gap between what I would say is how the ideal state should look like as far as designing a supply chain that works perfectly, and then the reality when you actually get to these organizations and see how people are running things. And what that means is, as a result of outdated software, outdated paradigms, outdated processes, brittle processes, uh, supply chains are not necessarily running as they were designed, not to mention some of the operational disruptions that happen either on the demand or supply side.
And so that's maybe a good segue into maybe just introducing yourself. And we
Yep.
could have done it a little bit earlier, but now that we're getting the conversation around technology and what it can and cannot do, maybe Anzar, maybe just start with how did you get involved in this space? What bit background about yourself? You just shared that yeah, you ran and operated businesses that were tied to cement and operations, but like where did it all start from you as a person? So walk me through like how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I am the lone science engineering graduate from a family full of businessmen. Originally, I went towards mechanical engineering, worked in the energy sector. I've always been split between two worlds in a way. One is actual applied business, and then the second aspect is science, math, and seeing how I can apply those things. So I've always kind of gone back and forth between academic concepts to actual applied work because I'm trying to bridge those two together. Because the idea is there has to be a better way to run organizations, there has to be a better way to run supply chains. And I'm a techie in some aspects, but at the same time, by blood, I'm a very applied business person. Regarding how I got involved in supply chain, when I was working in the energy sector, this was very we're talking about power plant design, optimization, working in civil engineering, working in construction. From there, I moved towards purely energy sector, optimization. We're talking about deterministic optimization, stochastic optimization. Some of the tools we were using were Simulink, GAMS, Garobi, Ample. So to bridge those two things together, when I was studying in Berlin, I had an idea that I wanted to actually understand how things flow as far as materials moved, as far as the energy sector with oil and gas, where you come from, metals, mining, and if there was a way to do it in a better way. So what the conclusion I came to at that point was, yes, there definitely is a better way from a math perspective, from a technical perspective. But it wasn't until, I joined Throughput and actually saw the reality of organizations and how they are, that I saw the large gap between what could be and what actually is these days.
So talk to me about that, right? So you've done some considerable projects in the supply chain space, working with DHL. You did an optimization for the Panama Canal for us several years ago. Speak to me on like what you have achieved so far in the space. You have some patents to your name in this as well. So talk to us as what you've done so far in the supply chain space in a very short career and how that's impacted the overall community outside of say throughput.
So I would say I'm still at the beginning of my career in this space. Yet at the same time, both with Throughput and outside of Throughput, I've done a lot of consulting at a strategic and operational level. I've built technologies that actually help bridge this gap that I was mentioning between supply chains as designed and how they're actually operated. So you keep bringing up, okay, educating operations on how supply chain works. It's also very important in educating supply chain on where their role and function lies. Because at the end of the day, it's all about how much are you actually pushing? Because the easy goal of a supply chain is to get a product from A to B in the lowest cost manner possible, at the right time, at the right place, in the right quantity. Um, and this is essentially where we work. We try to bridge this gap between what's designed versus what's executed. We try to make sure that the materials actually get there on time. So there's no lost downtime. There's no uptime issues at the same time as lost sales.
Yeah, so speak to me about that, right? So why did these problems actually occur, right? So I mean, with all the advent of technology and AI and visibility and everything today, why do we still have this problem of not being able to fulfill demand with the global supply chain available to do so today?
That's a very, let's say, big question, and it's very hard to just get down to specifics. But from a technology perspective, I would suggest that most of the solutions that are being deployed, they were built under very static assumptions. This would mean static lead times, ideas of specific point forecasts and demands. Uh, Again, this is, for a specific scenario you're designing, and you're attempting to operate your supply chain based on those very static assumptions. Yet the reality, and when this is one of those things about theory and practice. In practice, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're not. And this is essentially the gap that results due to organizational inertia, due to the technology paradigms that are still being used. We're talking MRP, MRP2, as a part of ERP technologies that have been around for 50 years. And we have the technology, we have the information, we have the tools, we have the algorithm. Bringing them all together is very difficult. Again, what we see in most organizations is that you have designed a supply chain, you have the software in place, you have your metrics, you have what the algorithm says you should do, and then in reality, anytime there's some sort of disruption, this could be on the demand side, there's a demand surge, demand spike, tariffs, it could be on the supply side. Based on those quoted contracted lead times, what's deviated from that, all of a sudden you have to re-optimize. And that's not necessarily something you could do from a technology perspective. Hey, you could just run it with new numbers and generate a new scenario on what you should do. But is that actually operationally feasible? So that's one aspect from a technology aspect. Now, having worked in some of these large organizations internally, I would say it's not necessarily even the technology aspect. It comes down to the education level and the supply chain professionals. It comes down to how the organization is set up, how supply chain itself is defined in that organization. And from what I, see, supply chain is typically thought of as a cost cutting function, which is fine, but at the same time, it is a very broad function that touches on everything. We can get into very specifics here, Ali, especially around who owns the metrics, who owns the P&L. It gets a bit trickier on there.
Yeah, that's always been a concept of for debate, right? Which is what is the true north of an organization? So you highlighted what technology can and cannot do, right? Um, what do you think are also the challenges? Like maybe speak to a manufacturing production angle. Why are these conversations not? I mean, do you come across these organizations? I mean, where or conversations for that matter, where they're trying to optimize something, say within the four walls, and they don't understand how that ties to supply chain and the overall, view of supply chain, especially in the U.S. where it's very freight oriented. Speak to me about like the production part of supply chain. Is that important? Not important? Why does it get overlooked? Why is it hard to work with? Since it seems like you have been focusing more on the like capacity optimization based on the tools that you've mentioned, both with what you were doing with energy grid optimization and now what you do as a practitioner.
Yeah, so when I worked in grid optimization, it was essentially a supply demand synchronization matching problem. But what I've realized is, unlike with electrons and unlike with let's say, the actuators and control systems under your control. Supply chains are a bit more messy. It involves real people, irrational decisions, I would say. And as far as the manufacturing and capacity piece, I would assume that that should be a very big aspect of supply chains. But based on, let's say, the modern state of the world, manufacturing itself has been outsourced in most cases. It's always been treated as a cost center, and as a result, it typically neither the software, and again, there are these legacy software packages and advanced planning systems that do try to incorporate manufacturing into it. But as far as the reality of most organizations, they think of manufacturing and supply chain as completely disconnected.
So you mentioned existing products, right? So there's been obviously a lot of mainstream success buying what's already on the market, and there's big billion-dollar companies, et cetera, that are doing that. So maybe just acknowledging like the mainstream, right? Like what has worked from a functional versus holistic perspective, and your thoughts on should we stay on this trajectory because the business is working and the software sort of solves the endpoint problem that's designed to do, or is there tangents to go off to get more off. So maybe just your thoughts on like mainstream solutions, because if they weren't solving problems, you wouldn't really have a business today, right?
Uh, I'm not sure if I completely agree with the fact that those solutions are necessarily solving the problem. They are good at what they do in being able to, let's say, aggregate data. But at the same time, I would question the operational impact of those solutions. What I mean by that is in most supply chains that I've seen, in most industrial organizations that I've seen, there is this hidden group of people that are actually working around those solutions. And typically, what this means is getting the information out from Excel. So, one of the things that we talked about earlier, most of these solutions and their recommendations, their actions, let's say from a material release perspective, they are working on very static assumptions. And in most organizations, there's a lot of firefighting whenever there's any sort of disruption downstream, as in there's a supply disruption, there's a new customer order, there's a delay. Most solutions are not built to handle those, let's say, emerging bottlenecks. And no one actually sees this. Once you buy the solution, it has a perfect idea of how it should be designed and how it should be operated. There is also sometimes a lack of training in terms of the people in being able to manage and wrangle these solutions, and especially in how solutions are being packaged and sold and which functions end up buying them. I would think that these solutions sometimes even create problems because everyone's operating on their own version of truth based on where they sit in the organization.
So to your point, like they you're saying that they operate on static assumptions. Is that something that they choose to do, or is that an organizational issue? Like what is the root cause of being pitched on a vision and then trying to make things work? Like what do you think is the underlying? Is it cultural? Is it technology? What is driving this? Hey, we know we shouldn't be using static assumptions. We live in a dynamic world, but is it just the best that we have today, or is there other underlying issues?
Uh, a bit of both, as in it's the best that we have today as far as what sort of technologies have been adopted by most of these organizations. But it's not that the technologies don't exist that can work in these sort of dynamic, environments. Yet yet the second aspect of this is are the people and the organizations themselves ready to change their paradigms? We're talking about decisions being made at the start of a budget year. Are you able to react in time to tariffs if pricing considerations change, if your sourcing locations are no longer feasible, if there's a war? I would assume that this organizational change, as far as the people change of changing the education, changing the processes, is more of a bottleneck than the technology itself.
Copy. So you speak to the rate of change, right? So clearly, as you've mentioned, the rate of change of technology is pretty fast, right? In our space, technology is there, and there's the rate of adoption, cultural change. So if the constraint is clearly still human, why is the focus not more on training people on, say, operational methodologies than jumping ahead and saying, "Hey, here's like the latest agentic AI, Gen AI tool." What do you? Why is there this disconnect, right? Because we've seen it ourselves. We're over 10 years, 15 industries. The tech's there. If we were in that position, we'd know exactly how to use it, right? But then, if you look at how long it takes some of at least our customers, or like on the throughput side, 2 to 3 years to adopt something to fully grasp it, like then where should the focus be if the rate limiting step seems to not be technology?
Okay, so I would say user training and adoption, but at the same time, you need time for that because, as I mentioned, most of the people that are operating these supply chains, they are swamped, they are drowning as a result of some of these problems that have been created. As in, they have specific shortcuts and things that they have to do in Excel to just get things moving. Now, if we're able to take that burden away from them, and again, it's less to do with finding the time to train them and make sure that they are comfortable with the new solutions that they have that can actually free them up. I would think it's more from a perspective of the organization itself and the inertia within it. What this could mean is that you've already bought a solution and you expected a certain ROI from it. If you are unable to meet that and you are afraid, and this is what one of our speakers will talk about, handling this sort of uncertainty, handling the fear of, let's say, making the right call but having a bad outcome. There are certain psychological aspects as far as organizational science that you have to handle. I think you brought it up from a change management perspective, and that's something that we end up doing anyway. Even though we're a software provider, we come in with the technology.
Yeah, so speak to me more about the gaps, right? I mean, there's a lot of gaps. There's millions of people, as far as I know, trying to solve the supply chain problem. So, what is, in your opinion, I guess in the last 10, 15 years you've been doing this, even further out, if you think about family businesses, like what are the key insights that you've picked up, right, so far in the supply chain piece that maybe other people may have not thought of yet, and maybe your thoughts on how to address them? So, are there any specific ones that come to mind immediately?
Yeah. So, from the perspective of gaps, I would say the technology is pretty much there. There are specific vendors and solution providers that can handle, let's say, uncertainty as well as variability, volatility, uncertainty, the VUCA. But at the same time, to get those organizations ready for these type of solutions, there needs to be a better, let's say, mm, there needs to be some clarity in terms of what they will be getting when they do this, and essentially a refocusing on what the purpose of the supply chain itself is. And as I mentioned, it's to get something from point A to B in the best manner possible, providing the most value to your customer. And what I see in most organizations is uh, people tend to forget that, as in the supply chain itself is serving a larger goal of the organization. This could be, let's say, mission readiness. It could be, more sales. It could be improved uptime. There needs to be a clarity around this because just like with other functions within the organization, you do have situations where everyone tends to optimize in their own silos. And supply chain, just by its nature, speaks to different, works horizontally across the organization. What I mean by that is when you actually get into warehousing or manufacturing, there are people responsible for inbound, outbound production, and they're working on different systems, they're working on different metrics, and they're looking at just a snapshot or a dashboard of what they need versus looking at something across the whole organization. How are their decisions actually tying to the overall goal and how the organization is performing? And this seems to be missing not just from the perspective of what sort of information is available, but also from the organizational design itself and how people are motivated from the KPI perspective.
So it makes sense, right? So I guess maybe a good tangent to this is we've been talking about the end customer on how they can be thinking of helping supply meet demand at a price point, all the microeconomics concepts, right, that you learn as a freshman in college. But talk to me more about the ecosystem, right? So clearly there's an ecosystem. There are vendors out there that have, way before you and I even were
Yeah.
born started looking at these supply chain problems and maybe solve them. So I guess the big question is what happened, right? Because that those systems provided superior competitive economic advantage at a time, but are the systems still doing that? Speak to me of the broader ecosystem, right? And what people you like, how do you see the communities today, right? Because it's much more fragmented than I believe it used to be. There's the operations research teams, there's the the planning systems or the MRO systems. Like, talk to me about the ecosystem, like how they're coordinating to solve like the global demand problem.
Uh, Big question again. Yeah, as you correctly mentioned, even before we got in this space or even before we were born, people had solved some of these problems previously. And this could be, older systems written in COBOL using some sort of EDI to connect, an OEM to their supplier network to downstream retail and their sales network. So people have previously solved these issues. And, there's a lot of different paradigms for this because a supply chain doesn't just work within your organization. And I think this is what most people miss. The supply chain includes your customers and your suppliers and anyone in between, whether it's 3PLs. Uh, what I've been seeing happen over the last 10, 15 years is as a result of, siloed, fragmented solutions being pitched to different organizations, there's issues with data interoperability, there's issues with information sharing. Ideally, you can't just think of a supply chain purely from the perspective of, okay, this is the information that I have within my organization, and this is the best decisions that I can make from a trade-off perspective, which is great because based on your available information, you're trying to make the best decisions.
Yeah.
But in reality, your supply chain extends into your suppliers, into their suppliers, into your downstream customers and the end users. And you ideally need some sort of solution that can uh, bring all of this together so you're actually making the decision that benefits everyone. We've seen, this happen. For example, Toyota does this with their supplier network. We've seen people at MIT talk about collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment. Yet, based on where the world is right now, based on data sharing issues, cybersecurity, um, this vision seems to be just moving further and further away. Again, you have to address all of these things. You can't, you do need cybersecurity, of course, but this level of trust that's needed between organizations for the data sharing, for the decisions that you can make from this data and information, I think it's a bit far off right now.
Yeah, and to speak to that answer, and I think not many people know that you basically have a very unique background in terms of you sort of are in 5 or 6 different supply chain circles. If you look at it, you do the startup part, obviously, then you're part of the AIML crew, then you're like the family business crew, right? Then the academia crew, and obviously the guys who work for big Fortune 500 logistics crew. So maybe just speak to, let's maybe go through each one of those communities. So help me understand how like academia looks at supply chain, right? You spend a lot of time with operations research types. So like maybe a perspective that you've picked up over the last 10 years on what you've done at like TU Berlin, MIT, um, you know, Dubai, Sharjah before that. I mean,
Yep.
a lot of different schools you've been through for mechanical and supply chain.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, even though I come from a business family, I've always been drawn to academia, science, and mathematics. I was a bit underwhelmed in actually seeing where academia is as far as the availability of brain power, the availability of access that can be used to actually solve a lot of these problems. Um, what I mean by that is there is a focus in academia and especially in operations research we know that, for example, all models are wrong. And yet, as a result of the way that academia is right now, as far as publishing papers, PhDs, grants, funding, um, there's just a lot of noise in academia as well, especially in the supply chain space. There are, specific people out there, for example, Warren Powell, that actually speak to some of this and have come up with, I would say, a revolutionary paradigm to solve at least, some of those issues that we talked about with static assumptions and how to bring in uncertainty into this sort of modeling. Yet, again, there's just too much of an inertia, I would say, in the academic circles and in the way that they approach these problems. There needs to be a closer connection to industry and actually applied problems, because all models, until they're actually field tested, will be wrong. And it's only by working with actual operations and actual industry that you're actually going to get, um, let's say, real solutions that generate impact.
So talk to me more about that, right? So I mean, if you think 100 years ago, it was all like Xerox Park and Rockefeller out in New York and like these they were like academia. They were very close to industry
Yep.
and to solve a lot of the problems of the early 1900s, right? What fundamentally changed? Where like was it just a focus on publications? Were Fortune 500s not aligned with doing more of these studies around supply chain and operations? Like what happened? Like why did it become so formula and academics related versus saying, hey, I want to solve this problem for hypothetically Tesla? So what do you think happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years? Because it's not like this stuff is new. Mathematics and material flow has been around for 60, 100 years, right?
Uh, Again, I'm not sure if I can fully answer that question, but thinking of one of our advisors who was formerly from Bell Labs, there seems to, again, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but at the same time, it seems like academics have withdrawn into their ideal world models, um, which is great, but at the same time, this connection to industry, and I've seen this before, um, it's almost becoming formulaic, as in, hey, we did some sort of, let's say, collaboration with a university and we are this company at the same time. It just turns into free academic work. And the marketing aspect of it seems to override the actual impact in the work itself, the reality of what they were able to solve. I'm not saying it's always the case. There are successful collaborations, and I enjoy reading those papers, those sort of case studies. But yeah, I think academia has its own issues as far as their metrics, their requirements on how many papers they need to publish, how many problems they need to solve. Yeah, that's for one of our other speakers from that world to actually speak to.
Yeah, so leaving the academia world alone. So
Yeah.
speak to me about, like, I guess we've spoken about family business. So how are we work with? I mean, obviously outside of your family businesses, you also work with family owned businesses, right? Talk to me about like that paradigm in terms of what they're thinking in terms of supply chains, where they're headed. Are they still, I mean, are they just happy with their SAP for HANA updates? Are they really trying to make more money? Talk to me about those sorts of businesses, because I think you worked with all sorts of companies, that food, chemicals, you name it, right? So your thoughts on, like, if you are a family business owner, like how critical is supply chain, versus, in most cases, if revenue's good and margins are good, who really cares, right?
Yeah. So family businesses only care about one thing: if they're making money. That's all they care about. What they don't even, most businesses don't even think of supply chain as a valuable function. They mostly think from an asset perspective, how much they're generating, what their cash flow is. They are probably a group that needs to understand how supply chain itself can help them, simply because the supply chain, as I mentioned previously, speaks to their suppliers, to their customers, what sort of levers that they couldn't pull from a pricing perspective, from managing lead times. As I mentioned with my own family business, uh, we had an advantage from a cost, speed, and quality perspective in a very, very rough environment in the third world. And the only reason we were able to succeed was because we had this sort of trust between our suppliers and customers. We were willing to pay, 20% more for cement as long as we had to cement when the crew was there for construction. And these sort of trade-offs, they teach you in academia, yet when I actually got into some of the larger, let's say, organizations, people tend to forget about this. As in, hey, I'm okay with taking a hit here if I have the ability to have a supplier on tap, if I have that sort of optionality, if it doesn't delay the rest of my project and have my labor just waiting around. So yeah.
So speaking of that, Anzar, right? So you clearly, on the family business side, obviously grew up in the Orange County area. Then you spent a lot of time in the Middle East, obviously, and then now in Europe. Talk to me about the different perspectives from a supply chain. What you remember, of course, different parts of your life, right? Um, what what you saw, what you picked up in those three different geolocations, right? Which all have sort of their own cultures in terms
Mhm.
of running a business.
So Orange County, I think I even remember as a teenager setting up flea markets in Anaheim. So I think from in the US, it's very sales focused. It's all about who can bring in the sales, who can sell. In the Middle East, it's about who can, extract the most from their labor. And I'm trying to say all of this in a very nice way. Europe, it simply seems to be work-life balance. When I say that, it's very, very slow. Um, so these sort of cultural changes in terms of how people approach business, and it also affects supply chain quite a bit in terms of how organizations are run. Again, we live in interesting times, so I do think most of this is going to change, especially with manufacturing locally becoming very important in all these environments now. Um, yeah, that's what I just know from a personal, intuitive, lived experience perspective. But probably also the same when we actually speak to some of our customers and organizations in this region. How fast they act, how fast they're able to react, how innovative they're willing to be. Uh, yeah,
Yeah. I won't let you pick a favorite country, but on that note, right? Maybe let's move over to corporates, right? So
yeah.
you did academia, you did family business. Talk to me about your corporate experience, right? So, where like, what's going on with the corporate world and supply chains, right? They have all the money in the world. They can buy any solution, buy any one they want for that matter, right? But why is it? Is it inertia? Why are these? Why are? I guess my question is why are not even the small problems solved in some of these big organizations, right? We understand you can't optimize a large organization that has thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but talk to me about like how are supply chains fixed in the big corporates of the world?
Uh, yeah, so it was a pretty rude awakening for me to actually be inside of a corporate environment and see the amount of waste that was within those organizations. How are even small problems not being fixed? Again, I would say that it also has to do with how supply chain is viewed inside those organizations, whether it's viewed holistically or as its own function. If it's its own function, it typically falls under a logistics bucket. And in that case, whether it's logistics or procurement, it simply becomes a lever for cost cutting versus larger improvements that you can have from a revenue perspective. Or again, I can tie it back to my family business. Who would be willing to pay more to a supplier if downstream it results in impact? So the way that the organization is set up and how your KPIs are you willing to take the hit on your KPIs on your supplier costs, even if it improves the overall organization in the project? So I would say it's organizational setup in most cases, but yeah.
Makes sense. I mean, so Fortune 500s. I know you've been both a vendor, part of it. As a vendor, speak to me. Like, what have been the challenges that you've seen? I mean, you worked across semiconductor,
Yep.
you name it. These days, you work with the valve company down south, food, like as a vendor, right? That's trying to help a company acquire knowledge or fix things. What is that experience like?
It's I would say it's very rewarding when people come around, because in most of these organizations, we just see huge opportunities. Again, I can even talk about internally speaking. It's very hard to move companies forward to exceptional when they're comfortable with the average, unless there's some sort of crisis. And as a vendor, we've had quite a lot of challenges simply because sometimes it seems easy what we do, simply because we've clarified and simplified what sort of actions need to be taken to, let's say, improve organizational performance in the supply chain sphere, uh, to the point where, you know, organizations themselves might be sometimes threatened if they were not able to do that internally. Now, as far as some of our successful partnerships, there's no ego, I would say. Uh, and it takes a while to build that, let's say, trust so they're not threatened, simply because we're there to help them. And this is the type of stuff that actually, gets us up in the morning, makes us happy because we see this large opportunity, right? Like 60% improvement on how you're doing. Since we work on the inventory side, anytime we see inventory, we know there's a problem. Like we see too much inventory, there's a problem. Uh, Within a year, within 2 years, once we actually see that improvement, it works great. Now, as far as the challenges, some of the things that we talked about with internal organizations, internal silos, manufacturing, supply, procurement, maintenance as different groups with their own metrics. Uh, we end up having to navigate all these politics for them, and quite frankly, as an external party, it seems a lot easier to do than being internal to the organization itself. It's almost playing a, let's say a therapist for the organization.
And I think that's what's required these days, right? To your point, where we're looking for the big win. What I found is unless you have great champions internally that understand what we're all working towards, it just doesn't work out. And obviously, not just one. What I found is that once you have a team of champions, once we get to about 5, 10 people, you see things go in an opposite direction than expected, right? So just on that, you know, uh, group of circles. So far we've covered academia, the big corporates, family businesses. Talk to me about startups, right? Because you have sort of your own little venture going on out there in Europe, and then obviously Throughput. So, what's your experience been with the startup ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, obviously supply chain logistics tech got suddenly hot, right? In the last, I would say, 2018 onwards, right? There was only a few real supply chain tech startups before that, right? And now industrial AI is taking off and other things. So, speak to me about like what's the state of supply chain tech or just the startups in general in your experience?
Supply chain tech and startups. Again, we could do with more startups in this space. Now, if whether the ecosystem supports actual startups that are solving a problem versus selling shiny toys, that's debatable. And having been in this space for a decade, it's just fun to see what sort of companies and ideas are being pitched, sold, what sort of companies come and go. Um, Again, I do like seeing new technology, but at the same time, the startup ecosystem in the space is, again, it's not as mature as I would think in other spaces, such as fintech, these sort of things. Because again, it's a hard sell in this space, I would say, because most of the people that you're selling to are on the other side of 50. They are able to manage their supply chains even with outdated tools, as I mentioned. They're able to, hack things together with Excel. Uh, Scaling in this space, I would say, is difficult until you've proven yourself out, especially because the sales cycles are so long and there is a lot of internal groups within these organizations that are responsible for the problem that you claim to solve, even if you've actually solved it. It's definitely a challenge. But yeah, I would say there's only maybe two or three other startups outside of us that I actually respect in this space.
Both claims, but that's on the lines, right? Of like,
Yep.
what are the challenges? Because you've been part of it, right? So what is the challenge of a startup besides like people not understanding, people not funding? That's all. Like every other startup has that issue, but supply chain tech or just like what is the challenge? The customer not understanding, getting the budget? Is it the startup pitching more that they can actually do? Like who is the culprit here, right? Because supply chain talks about collaboration. It's like, oh, we're all like,
Yep.
holding hands to meet demand, right? Because like that's the ultimate goal, at least from my perspective, of any supply chain is to meet 100% of the demand when they need it, right? And make some
Yep.
money in terms of a price that works for everyone. But like what for people because we're on later episodes, I will be hosting brand new startups and first time founders, repeat founders, unicorn
Yep.
founders, you name it, right? So, like, talk to me about the challenges from your perspective, right? In terms of baby budding startup, what's the issue? Product has reached a certain maturity, what's the issue? And then takeoff velocity, what's the issue? So, maybe let's start with baby budding startup, right? Which is what are the challenges there?
Budding startup challenges there. When we get into supply chain and when we get into these organizations, there's these huge categories as far as what you do: inventory management, revenue management, pricing. There's a lot of problems to solve. We spoke about it when we talked about corporate environments and the large amount of waste in those organizations. One of the challenges is just being able to, if you are, let's say, in the technology or information space, specifically as a startup, without any sort of physical assets under your control, it is a challenge because most of that data is locked away with legacy providers, legacy vendors within the company itself, within the organization, who the data is not ready for some of these larger, AI pitches in most organizations. That's the reality. Uh, they don't know what data they need. Um, there is probably someone in that organization that knows what sort of information and what sort of actions they need to take, but most of the organizations are unaware of what is needed from a data perspective, from an information perspective. And even if you've solved for that, getting the buy-in as far as people trusting your recommendations and outputs and your software itself, uh, it will take a while simply because, again, most people in supply chain, and they are very, let's say, good at what they do, but it's going to be a big challenge, especially as a new company, to convince them to see things, let's say, your way, or get them to see things in another way, especially if you've found the opportunity.
So why do you think people are so skeptical, right? I mean, I sort of spoke to this on our on the document we put together and posted on why we're starting the Supply Unchained podcast. But like my like what is the skepticism, right, in this space where if you see a problem, you can solve it, you've actually solved it, and you have a better way of doing it, and you have track record. Like why do you feel that every professor, every investor, every customer is like, well, hold on, like that didn't work 30 40 years ago? Are they sort of stuck in the demand profile of that time, right? Like what is the underlying issue? And some people say we've already solved it, but then obviously from our perspective, the demand signal in the world has changed, right? So how have you already solved something when not everything is connected? So talk to me about the skepticism in this space, because is it just cultural? Is it because supply chain, the community has always been disregarded, called a cost center? It's like, hey, your job is to cut costs, not come up with new ways to run the business. And obviously, there's industries and companies that have invested in supply chain that are wildly successful, right? Amazon and Apple didn't get there by default, and what's happening now in China with the electric vehicle market, right? And then all the production coming out there. So talk to me about that. Like, what is the skepticism of new ideas not working, or 'cause, everybody talks about the math that's already been solved, and we already did this 40, 50 years ago. What are you adding that I can't bring three or four of my best people from some ex consulting firm or just from my PhD research program together to build? Like, why? What is that culture?
I mean, I think you answered your own question. There is a large amount of skepticism around this because, A, it seems easy to do. Um, Second, as you mentioned, most of the math has been solved. But again, a lot of these capabilities, as we mentioned, even before we were in this space or even before we were born, the companies that had solved this, those capabilities have disintegrated. And what I mean by that is not whether those technology and those systems don't work, because of course there's newer technology, there's faster information sharing, there's faster data. It's about the actual operators and practitioners in supply chain. As there's a generational changeover, you need to rebuild those capabilities, because some of these ideas, as we mentioned, and we're going to bring in other speakers, whether it's Toyota, whether it's Apple, whether it's Amazon, Walmart, some of these larger companies that are good with their supply chain and use it as a competitive advantage. Uh, they had to build that over a certain time. Um, right now in this space, the skepticism, I would say, is because there are a lot of vendors out there that are promising shiny toys, and they're promising shiny toys for a very specific problem. Let's say, agentic, consume all the possible information, optimize all the nodes. But that doesn't necessarily work with the reality of supply chains, because while you as an OEM might have the perfect system, perfect control tower, all of this information, an end tier supplier network that you're utilizing might not have perfect information. So they're still making decisions. As I mentioned earlier, if it was purely from a math perspective and we had automated everything, it's simply demand supply matching from a electron perspective or electricity perspective. Yet, anytime in supply chain, when you have people, everyone's making irrational decisions.
Yeah.
And outside of supply chains, let's say business, what I've realized is even if you, let's say, propose a solution to your partner, to your supplier, to your customer that seems really good for both of you, people will make irrational decisions. And that tends to happen quite a bit in supply chain.
Yeah, and on that tangent, right? I'd maybe go into the last community that you're part of, and maybe there's more communities you can bring up that I'm not aware of.
Yeah.
But so the AI/ML data science community, right? So
Yeah.
talk to me about that community. Obviously, with the boom going on right now and where they're at, I mean, what is the reality of supply chain there, right? I mean, do they have the use cases figured out? Is it just mostly computer vision stuff? All right, talk to me about that community and being part of that community, right? So, like, what
Yeah.
are the challenges there? Is it data engineering? Is it ontology? Like, over to you.
Yeah. So the AI ML community has a lot of momentum behind it, has a lot of funding. It's very mature, I would say, from the perspective of roles. What it has been missing is, I would say, the use cases, because there's a lot of technology algorithms that are both open sourced and quite common that you could use and create a lot of advantage. But at the same time, tying it to actual business problems and the actual workflow of the users, there's a large gap. Most of the solutions that do tend to have traction, let's say Palantir, is because they've built some sort of, let's say, sandbox environment where the practitioner themselves can create something. However, they're still lacking on the actual use cases that create operational impact. What that means is, do I need all the possible nodes and all the possible information before I can give a solid recommendation? Because learning purely from the past or learning purely from, let's say, the internet knowledge base as far as Gen AI is not going to have some of those key assumptions and specific knowledge to those organizations and to those supply chains and ecosystems that people have been spending decades on. Because while supply chain itself might be a new term when we're talking about logistics and material flow, this is very, very old knowledge. And there's a lot of expertise that we hope to, bring on to this podcast that is very important for, let's say, the AI ML community to also grasp.
Yeah, to speak to that, right? So if they don't have the use cases figured out, a why are they not coordinating with companies or end customers that can figure it out? And speak to me on the data readiness challenge, right? Which is everybody on the market is basically pitching, we will be your single source of truth. We will consolidate everything. I think speak to me what's changed from like, the last 30, there's a vendor 40 years ago pitching this, another 30 years ago pitching this, 20 years ago pitching this, 10 years ago pitching this, and now there's a new one, right? So like why are they not able to achieve what they set out to do? And then maybe we can transition into speaking to like what you might be working on, right? Which is like, okay, what I see in the market is a lot of people make a lot of bold claims and say, and the solution to the problem is buy my services, right? So explain to me like how that operates. Why hasn't this problem been solved? I think you've spoken to it earlier, but explain to me why the gap still exists, right? Even with all of these new age technologies that are supposed to be solving the problem, and they're sort of solving the problem, or they're making it a little bit better, or they're just creating more work.
Yeah. So lots to unpack there. Perhaps we can start with some of the newer technology. Let's say agentic workflows, Gen AI. These sort of solutions have been heavily invested into by most of these organizations. What I've noticed is they don't actually make it to the hands of the operational end users, the people with the P&Ls, the people actually making the supply chain decisions. They tend to get stuck with the IT and analytics groups. And simply because those technologies themselves, well, let's say Gen AI seems quite user friendly from an interface perspective. Um, they tend to just be shiny toys for the IT and analytics departments to play with. The budget is also important as far as where you're able to get the budget from within the organization, as far as the responsibility of maintaining, using, fine tuning some of these technologies. If we're able to get it to the hands of the operational end users who are able to validate it based on how they've been running things and how they actually see things, any information that's not in the data, not in the data training these algorithms, as well as making those decisions, they're able to be that guardrail on top of this. And that's something that we've been solving for, and that we would suggest that any sort of AI ML company should also solve for, as in either make your technology very easy to use by the operational end user, which is the sandbox perspective, without actually, resulting in a lot of cognitive load on these operational end users. Remember, they're drowned as far as their work goes. Um, or the other aspect would be that start small from the perspective of pick a very targeted use case. When I say start small, it doesn't necessarily mean from a scope of what sort of decisions you're making, because the impact could be quite large. But go after a very specific problem, solve it, um, create that impact ROI, trust building from the operational end user themselves, and eventually get them hooked on it to the point where they are able to help you improve your technology, fine tune it.
So yeah, to that note, right? I mean, that's the right way of doing things, right? But the question becomes, well, if the end user just wants to buy Gen AI, and clarify for this with
Yeah.
me, because obviously, if you're using numbers to do optimization, how are you going to use numbers to do Gen AI, which is basically looking for words, right? Um, Say the initiative within a company is, hey, I just need Gen AI. What can be done, right? So a lot of buyers, from what I've seen, is they're just looking, to your point, for the latest tool to add to their tool shed. To say,
Yeah.
oh, I went to Home Depot and I bought everything except for snowblower that's
Yeah.
electric power, and then that's what I need this year because I have everything else, right? So for there's two types of buyers, right? There's like I just need to have everything for rainy day, right, or a snowy day, and then there's the type that say I'm building a house. What do I really need to build the house, right? So for the first set of buyers who are more like, hey, I just need snowblower with that's electric powered now. How do they get the most out of what they're buying, right, in the supply chain space today, from what you see in terms of use cases? And then for the more precise buyers who like, hey, I have a certain, I want to build a house certain way. I don't like marble. I like this, right? Going back to some of the family business you've been involved with, how do they get the most out of the tools that they already have?
Yeah. So taking the analogy of building a house as well as building a software, there seems to be this, let's say, misconception that you're able to design the perfect software or the perfect house that can solve all the problems and have the right tools when you need them. But the way that software is essentially sold into these organizations is that once the checklist has been fulfilled, let's say, because the organization itself also wants to push that, hey, we bought Gen AI, we're doing cool things, we have the shiny toys. As far as that technology being actually utilized the right way, um, yeah, there is a large gap between what the technologies promise to do as far as the vision versus what the actual impact is. Now, there are certain companies, certain organizations that are able to, let's say, as you mentioned, they buy more, let's say, they buy more in a fashion according to their needs. But in being able to, let's say, you eventually need some sort of expert to come in, right? Like, hey, you bought all these tools. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to build your house. These are the tools you should be using. And this sort of knowledge is missing from the people that actually buy the solutions within the organization themselves.
Makes sense. And to the point, right, where we can call out the supply chain community as it is, right? But the question is, a lot of people point out the problem, right?
Yep.
These days, it's always like, oh, and, they're not using spreadsheets. They're not using. They got to move to
Yep.
some central system, right? That's the latest thing I've been hearing for the last 3 4 weeks, at least in my circles. But talk to me about like what you're doing today to fill the gap, right? I think this is not mentioned it enough by I say, and I hope have all the guests that we bring on. We're aiming for about 26 this year, so every other Friday is what our
Yep.
cadence. But tell me about what you're working on today that fills a gap, right, within the supply chain ecosystem that was not previously filled, or it makes it a little bit better.
Yeah. So continuing on this analogy with, selling the perfect software that's already comes with all the bells and whistles, as well as from the organizational side, what they actually want versus what they need. I think there needs to be honesty on both sides from the vendor and the organizational perspective, because you're never going to be able to build the perfect house or solution that everyone's going to love. At the same time, you do need that custom work, let's say interior designing and decorating based on how the organization wants to use that house. Similarly, the organization itself needs to be quite honest as far as, do they have the people that can operate the software, let's say, moving away from the house analogy for a second. Um, what we actually end up doing is we do have a software that solves a problem, but we don't necessarily expect you to learn the software by yourself. The idea here is that we try to fit the software to your operations. And from a modeling perspective, it's an operations first methodology to the software, how it's built. It's very customizable. It has a skeleton, let's say again, I'm going back to the house analogy. It has, let's say cement outer casing. It solves a specific problem, but the interior aspects of it, we try to keep it modular, we try to keep it flexible so it actually fits to your operations. And there is a process that we do with this, because unlike other vendors that would say that, okay, it's completely turnkey, it can be completely turnkey if you are, let's say, a complete expert in, and we've seen some of our users like this, they just log on and they immediately know what to do. But in most cases, there is a bit of a hand holding aspect that lasts a little bit, like lasts a few training sessions.
Couple
Uh,
months.
yeah.
Yeah. No, and to your point, right? So why aren't in this space software is operation centric? I mean, why are they back end support centric?
Uh, Again, have a theory. One aspect would be simply because the people that should be using the software that could drive the most impact and decisions out of it, let's say, I say operations loosely, but it could be a procurement professional, it could be a maintenance professional, are typically swamped with what they're doing right now, to the point where even learning a new software would be difficult for them. So you have to essentially get to the point and see what it's going to do for them. Because if you're going to Home Depot and you're buying a snowblower, you know exactly what it's going to do for you. And that's essentially how the software should be communicated and built from a UI UX perspective. And this is what, for example, a lot of these AI ML companies are starting to realize that the user experience and the user interface is becoming very important. And while we can pitch visions of eventually we'll have smart glasses which will serve as a new UI or AR or VR,
Yeah.
uh, people still are using Excel in supply chain. We're not that far ahead as an industry, and it can be incremental. There could be a form of progressive disclosure that, hey, you could get to an expert tier, but it has to be an easy entry into being able to utilize the software. And when people try to create very complex solutions, it ends up being too overwhelming for most users.
Yeah, and to speaking to that, right? So clearly, the future of supply chain is upon us. What many of the items that you're speaking to, when I started looking at things in 2015 as like this would be a game changer, has not really changed the game 10 years on, right? I mean, there were same products then, but adoption has been low. What do you see as like the in the next 12 months, like the big trends in supply chain, right? And like you can speak to it from a geopolitical perspective if you think that's important, right? With tariffs going on, or tech perspective, like for the next 12 months or even beyond, like what do you predict is probably going to happen?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I could look at it from the perspective of where the market's trending right now, where I wish the market was going, and somewhere in between what's actually going to end up happening. Uh, I'm not going to be a geopolitical pundit or try to crystal ball it here. As far as where the market is moving, there does seem to be a lot of pushback on some of these older vendors and solution providers that have not lived up to their promises. And we saw a bit of this with both, some of the larger supply chain thought leading organizations as well as the vendors. There does seem to be a push towards, let's say, software that can handle uncertainty. Uh, a part of this could be decision making under uncertainty, and there does seem to be a push towards this. There is a push towards, let's say, the agentic AI, where if we have unreliable people that are not making the right decisions, let's see if we can automate it. Um, but I don't think either of those will happen in the next 12 months, at least not for the uh, majority of organizations. The only organizations that can benefit from this are ones that already have their processes in place, have a strong technology backbone, and are able to utilize technology. But for the majority of the world, and even some of these, let's say, leading organizations, they still have suppliers that need to catch up. Now, as far as where I wish things would move towards is manufacturing decisions and supply chain becoming embedded once again, because the idea of being able to turn levers to be able to scale up, and ramp down capacity, and it doesn't necessarily have to be investment from your side, but having a network, let's say, of suppliers that you could utilize and have that sort of optionality, that seems like a supply chain professional's dream. That, hey, if something happens, do I have options where I can scale up manufacturing in a different location? Do I have other suppliers that I can use when someone is delayed or there's some sort of disruption? That's where I think things should be moving towards. But yeah, I think the big buzzwords for this year are agentic, resilience. All of that takes some sort of investment and time. Um, until then, you're always going to have disruptions. I don't think there's ever been a year where supply chains haven't had disruptions.
And that's an important point, right? And I guess last question before we move over to what the users can expect, the audience can expect. I'm used to saying users because we're always selling software, but this is not a throughput podcast. This is just
Yeah.
the first pilot of it. So talk to me about like you are where you are today because you put in the effort and time for up and coming supply chain professionals or people who are trying to get into either family businesses or startups or the corporate world. Like, what are some of the tips that you might give to maybe accelerate their, for lack of a word, throughput in their journey to get to where you got to over the last 8, 10, 15 years?
Again, don't want to give some sort of generic platitudes or ideas. could just essentially talk about my experience. When I started in this space, and especially with throughput, I got hit with a fire hose of information, wisdom, knowledge, and the type of access we had to some of the speakers that you will also speak to and uh, get to hear speak. Um, I would say a constant um, curiosity as well as an ability to learn and an attitude of challenging your own assumptions. And this is not necessarily even from some of these huge supply chain gurus and experts that you'll get to hear from. Even the people that you work with. You know, we have people on our team that are challenging assumptions from old supply chain equations and actually find problems in them. So it's very inspiring to be part of a environment like that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Always looking to learn and learn from others.
Thanks, Anzar. So yeah, and to that note, I think it's a good segue to why we started this podcast to begin with. Is a lot of it is about preserving knowledge, and it is an effort to seek out this knowledge and get people to speak. And what I found over the last few years is probably you is people are very accessible in terms of just hey, if you want to share ideas, think of other ways. They're willing to share their stories, and like you pointed out, why should we reinvent the wheel when it's already been solved for? So, to give you an idea of like what to expect for future episodes, right? Because I mean, we have a format. We typically keep it to one hour, but we can go over if we have a really interesting speaker, right? And some of these guys are truly iconic in our space, and we're honored to for them to be spending some time with us. But beyond the hey, what's your story? What are you working on? What do you see? What can from your some of the audience that you'll be interviewing, what to expect for future episodes that I think we'll try to air every other Friday.
Yeah. So some of the audience that we will be interviewing, as Ollie mentioned, they're quite iconic. They're very open and free with their knowledge and their wisdom. I am very much looking forward to, let's say, finding the signal within the noise that is in the space, because pretty much everyone could be an expert or influencer. Yet these are people that have been solving these problems for decades and are truly experts that have been there at the, let's say, the inception of some of these great supply chains and companies that we see today.
Yeah, an incredible lineup. So just to give you an idea, like we'll be interviewing everyone and anyone in supply chain. And the reason why Anzar and I are both alternating is because we have different strengths. As if you've seen, Anzar is more today from the audience. Hopefully, you were able to pick up where he comes from. I typically focus on very general, high level questions, as Unzer's been so fortunate to answer today. They're a little bit more philosophical, but we're hoping to, have academia on. We will be interviewing journalists. We will be interviewing independent analysts. We'll be interviewing military people who ran operations as generals. Private equity turnaround experts who used supply chain as a core advantage, people who like were number two to the person at supply chain first for Walmart, and then ran logistics at Starbucks back when it was taken off, and people who rethought Dell's supply chain systems many years ago. So great lineup coming up. But from my perspective, what we're trying to do is try to get people from different audiences to speak and really get the answers out and provide a perspective, because what we found in the supply chain space is there's no one that's an expert of the entire supply chain, but they're experts in the silos or the roles that they have exposure to. I don't want to use silos because it might be offensive, but it's just everybody has certain exposures to certain supply chains and industries that they know better than others, and it would take more than a lifetime to learn them all. But I think I hope this goes on for a couple of years, but we hope to expose you to more frameworks that can be useful to at least rethink how you're thinking about supply chains beyond where I started, which was min max of inventory and figuring out why I'm not getting something. So with that, what we like to do is obviously thank Anzar Kamdar for being our first guest today. And thank you to the audience for tuning into the Pod episode. The next one will air on Friday. We have a couple guests already lined up, and we'll be rehearsing with them. So thank you, everyone. Have a happy new year, and look forward to learning and listening from you this year. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.